Welcome again to the penultimate talk in our 2021 Invisible Histories series. Today, our speaker is Geraldine Van Bueren QC, whose topic is Prohibiting Class Discrimination, Taking Equality Seriously. And we're particularly grateful to her as she's joining us, though feeling rather unwell. The library's events are, as usual, free. However, as I always say, we would like to encourage you to support us if you feel able to do so. And there is a donate button on our website. Okay, Geraldine, thanks again, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. As you can hear, I'm not 100%. I don't have COVID, I hasten to add. But if you can't hear me, just wave your hands. I also like being interrupted, actually. So if you disagree or have a question, or haven't made things clear, then please unmute yourselves. I like speaking to unmuted groups. And I was looking forward to coming to the library, but it hasn't been possible, but I certainly hope to come up and join you sometime. Why is it after a day's work, many working class people feel exhausted after having, not because of the work, but because we may have spent the day speaking differently than we do at home. We try to participate in a culture which has maybe made no effort to make us feel welcome, and also often without thinking derides working class culture. And I read an example of this really sort of unconscious bias, and we tend not to think of that in relation to class discrimination. But there was a piece in the Times on a Millennium Cohort study. And the results of the research were that a higher percentage of middle class students shoplifted in comparison to working class students. And the researcher who conducted the study said, and I quote, she found the results puzzling and quote, you would think it would be the other way round. Why would it be the other way round? Does being born working class mean we have a greater propensity to steal? So many of us remain or remained quiet about our working class heritages. And we have to ask, is such silence good for society and good for business? Where do we draw the boundaries of equal opportunity? And class discrimination is lawful in the United Kingdom and in many countries, not all, but in many countries around the globe. So when a student told me she'd been shortlisted for an interview with a firm of solicitors, and at the interview she was told, well, you're a good candidate, but actually the social gap between you and the other lawyers is too great. The solicitors, were acting lawfully. And they couldn't have said that in relation to sex, race, sexuality, disability, all the protected characteristics. And I've got academic colleagues and professional colleagues in the United States and in the UK who said they found it harder to come out as working class than to come out as gay. And this gives you an idea of the depth of the prejudice. So what is it about that student's background, my background, other working class backgrounds, heritages, as my colleague Carol Binns calls it, which is a very helpful term, which are fundamental to our identities and our sense of self, but that actually makes us invisible to the protection of law? And I want to make it clear at the beginning, by class, I mean a richly diverse concept of class, not the one portrayed as Caucasian by the media as being Caucasian and male. And this, in fact, is the advantage of working class and of class. It's a unifying force because it is richly diverse. It embraces sex, gender, race, religion, disability, all the other protected characteristics under the Equality Act and under international human rights treaties. And I want to explore with you two main goals, because I think now is the time to include an express prohibition against class discrimination in national, regional, and international law, because class remains important. It hasn't been relegated to history. And to be clear, I'm not going to argue that only working class discrimination should be prohibited, and I'd be very interested in your thoughts on this, but I think all forms of class discrimination are unacceptable for democratic societies based on justice and dignity. But do we have to do nothing until we achieve law reform? And I think the answer is no. I think there's a lot we can do practically and constructively. And I want to discuss with you what I think may be the world's first code, the University Code, which has been drawn up by we professionals from a working class heritage. And firstly, I think we have to ask ourselves, is there actually a difference between social mobility and prohibiting class discrimination? And spoiler alert, the answer is yes. We can prohibit class discrimination and have social mobility programs, but social mobility alone is very valuable, achieves much, but cannot achieve everything that prohibiting class discrimination would do. A prohibition on class discrimination would apply to everybody. And when a prohibition has a force of law, it creates or should create a transparent accountability that can lead to training, which in turn changes attitudes and approaches. And law has a powerful symbolic value. It says we value all members of all classes. As social mobility, despite the excellent work of many, including the Social Mobility Commission, is generally optional. It doesn't apply to everybody. So it has to be selective and is often very dependent on charitable funding. But if we as a society believe that every child and every adult ought to be judged on our abilities and helped in overcoming hurdles for which people are not responsible, then why arbitrarily exclude class discrimination? I think such an arbitrary exclusion offends against the rule of law. And another added value in prohibiting class discrimination is it would lead to a change in culture, so that insulting terms such as chavs, toffs, Essex girls in England, I'm a Cockney and we then later in life moved to Essex, so a bit sensitive about Essex girls. And I think that changing language could lead to a change in political and media perceptions and depictions. Because the class into which we are born is still very important. It affects so many aspects, even the most fundamental, life expectancy. There's a significant and unacceptable difference in life expectancy in the United Kingdom between different classes, even in adjacent boroughs of the same city, as was reported in a World Health Organization study in Glasgow. And in the London borough of Camden, a 10-year difference in life expectancy in neighbouring areas was reported by its local MP. So this is a clear case of inequality affecting the right to life, but it's almost impossible to initiate litigation based around that type of inequality. And this also points to another difference between prohibiting class discrimination and social mobility. Not everyone who's working class wishes to be socially mobile. They enjoy their lives, where and how they live, and that's fine. But social mobility will not help them if they're discriminated against unjustifiably. Social mobility alone cannot rectify the salary gap that a 2017 report, which was commissioned by the Social Mobility Commission, found. And a 1996, and this is not new, a 1996 study found the same was true in Norway. And so people will continue to be paid less unless such a discrimination is prohibited by law. In the interim, a number of us decided we weren't going to just sit around and accept this. We thought there were things we could do. So we established the Alliance of Working Class Academics, and we're international. And please look at our website, and if you wish, join or send us an email or a tweet. And our goal is to offer support to students and academics coming from working class backgrounds, to persuade and educate universities and other public bodies that class discrimination needs to be taken as seriously in the same way as other forms of discrimination and prejudice. And we want to work with bodies in overcoming such discrimination. The Guardian actually, when we established it, asked me for an interview, and to my astonishment, it went viral. I mean, why did the interview go viral? And what does this mean in terms of society? I think it went viral because people saw this as a constructive and peaceful way of questioning the underrepresentation of working class people at all levels. And last month, our Alliance of Working Class Academics adopted the University Code on equal opportunity for working class students and academics. It's an international code designed to be adopted by different countries and different class cultures, and it can also serve as a template for business. And the university's code, the aim is to transform the image of being working class so that it's not seen as a disadvantage for society to have working class members within it. So we're not regarded as objects, but as equal participants. And this is because the exclusion of certain classes robs countries of much potential. In a relatively short time as chair, I've met with Universities UK, which is the governing representative body of universities. And they've included their code in their newsletter for university vice-chancellors. I've also met with the Office for Students, the government regulator, and they've put the code up on their website. And the Scottish Minister for Higher Education was also very positive about it in a meeting. The code is short, it's in a language easy to understand, and calls for the equal treatment of working class heritage staff in recruitment, retention, salaries, and promotion. And it calls on universities to recognise the additional hurdles that many students face, both in their first and in their postgraduate degrees, to help students overcome these hurdles. And it asks for the universities to discuss the application of the University Code with its students and staff, and to publish a plan of action on how the university will actually implement the code effectively. Universities prize intellectual vigour, networking, grant raising, speaking eloquently in public, a very different skill set which much of the media portray as being working class. And if universities could start taking class seriously, then so could others. If you look at company boards, very few members are from working class backgrounds, unless they've created the company, Alan Sugar, for example. So what have those of us from working class backgrounds to offer? People from working class backgrounds are accustomed to adapting differently to different cultures. It means we can work in different sectors, cultures, and globally. I don't think it's unconnected to my background that I've advised governments in Africa and Asia, worked in Latin America, as well as Europe and the UN. A working class background may be seen by many to be a disadvantage, but I think it could also be advantageous. And people from working class backgrounds are ambitious. We're used to putting our dreams into practice. Another advantage of attracting working class talent is we're used to taking calculated risks. Again, we've had to do so in order to survive and to progress. And finally, most working class cultures are communal. So we like and are used to a team spirit. Now, I'm not saying these advantages are unique to working class people. That would be absurd. Nor am I arguing that all working class people are saints. But it is important to stress the strengths of people from working class backgrounds because of this frequent drip of negative stereotyping. Now, some may sympathise but feel very uneasy about abolishing class discrimination because such notions of equality are entangled with notions of revolution and dictatorship. So we may leap to the conclusion that all attempts to prohibit class discrimination have been prompted by communist and former communist states, but that's not the case. During the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, our fundamental international global Bill of Rights, much of the efforts to include an express prohibition of class discrimination, which unfortunately failed, came from Latin America. The United Kingdom stated it did not object to including a prohibition on class discrimination, and the UK is not known as a revolutionary communist state. Now, this strive for equality of opportunity does not belong exclusively to the left, the right, or the centre. And some democratic governments also think class continues to be important, not just in Britain. Until the recent government reshuffle, Canada had a minister in its government for middle class prosperity. I don't know who looked after the prosperity of the other classes, but it's still important because it demonstrates that in some form, class is still matters, it's important. And Cyprus expressly prohibits class discrimination in its constitution, which shows that such a prohibition is achievable in democratic states. class is also expressly mentioned in the Constitution of India. Now, it's mentioned in a language which to my ears is undesirable, as it refers to backward classes and socially and educationally backward classes, albeit to improve the life conditions and representation of underrepresented groups, as is set out in their constitution. And the Indian Supreme Court has said that caste is often a form of social class, linking it to occupation and poverty. And it's also said that those who've already benefited from such protection should not do so over and over again. So India's example, I think, shows that class is capable of being described beyond the traditional Western working and middle class, and is capable of being identified by different countries according to the relevance of different classes. And in South Africa, a major organization brought a case concerning a lack of policing in one of the townships and described its membership as Black, working class and poor. And in the UK, the Runnymede Trust, in its recent evidence to the Education Committee, argued we should recognise that the working class has been left behind and actively held back. And these issues affect all working class people, including Black and minority ethnic working class groups. So law is capable of dealing with class issues. Traditionally, the laws excluded and reinforced class barriers, telling people what they could eat, which different foods they could eat. There was great detail in the law, and also in relation to voting, exclusionary. And there has been for over half a century space for courts to read into existing human rights treaties a prohibition on class discrimination, but it hasn't happened. The European Convention on Human Rights says in Article 14 that people should not be discriminated against in the exercise of their rights on any ground, such as social origin, property, birth, or other status. And this non-exhaustive list is also repeated in the Human Rights Act. And clearly it's possible to read into social origin, birth, and other status, class discrimination. In fact, I would argue that its non-exhaustive nature, because it finishes up with any other status, together with the context of property and birth and social origin, clearly demands such a reading, but this has not happened and is unlikely, I think, to occur for a long time, which is why I think we have to call for class discrimination to be excluded and prohibited. Now, the terms may vary from country to country, such as blue collar in the United States, but I think there's added value in us acknowledging that class is an important facet of many people's identities. Now, there are challenges, and one hears when one argues for it, how do you define it? And when I was involved in drafting a treaty called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is actually the world's most widely ratified treaty, and it took a decade for us to reach global consensus on definition. I hasten to add we were doing other things, but definition is often, it didn't stop us. Definition is often a reason raised by those who wish to retain the status quo. But lawmakers rarely arrive at a short, non-exhaustive definition of who should be protected against discrimination. Excuse me, I just need to get some water. Some of you may have heard I've got a bit of a bug and it's affecting my voice. Thank you. So sometimes in law, definitions are deliberately broad. Both treaty law and many national laws prohibit discrimination on the basis of belief. But trust is left in the implementing bodies and the courts to set the boundaries. So the courts have found belief to include things from veganism to secularism. And so if we have such a broad definition, courts are quite clearly capable of dealing with class discrimination. Now, some people say, well, actually, there's too much fluidity in defining class. People sometimes feel they've moved from one class to another. How do you define it? But I don't think this should be an obstacle. The right to change one's religion is protected in human rights, and that's fluid and never been a problem. Similarly, in relation to gender issues. The fluidity argument is also in some senses self-denying. As the American writer Bell Hook has argued, We don't have to necessarily abandon all our working class cultural values in order to move into spheres traditionally the domain of other classes. So, as with religion and the other prohibited characteristics, you can leave enough space for courts, for bodies, on a case-by-case matter and basis to decide whether an issue amounts to class discrimination. And there have been other approaches in trying to improve the lives of poorer classes. These include the term poverty class, referred to in some Canadian writings, lower socioeconomic status, cited in Australia, socioeconomic status, which is a proposal for our UK Equality Act, and the French concept of social exclusion. I think our first approach must be to adopt a language that respects everyone's dignity and heritage. I'm proud to say I come from a working class background, but the terms poverty class and low or lower socioeconomic status are intrinsically disempowering, I think, and lacking in dignity, as is the term underclass. Now, with COVID-19, industrialized societies have become more independent and dependent upon frontline workers, many of whom come from working class backgrounds. And this, I think, is beginning to result in a long overdue re-evaluation of working class people. I think this creates an opportunity to re-examine our laws on human rights and what we consider fair and discrimination, and ask whether it offends against our sense of fairness that class discrimination remains legal. So whilst class discrimination is not prohibited by law, I would recommend a sort of sector approach, not just individual companies, but entire businesses and industries, as we have done with the University Code. Because I think the more social mobility we have, the easier it will be to change the law and prohibit class discrimination. Thank you very much, and I do apologise for my voice.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. You were definitely audible throughout and entirely cohesive and coherent. So thank you very much indeed for that. I really liked the phrase about working class people being used to putting our dreams into practice. That feels like that's I don't know, that should become a slogan for the library in some way. So I've noted that one there. And we have somebody with a question already in the chat. Folks, if you want to either be thinking of a question and put it in the chat or wave at me while I ask this one, then that would be great. Chris says, well, it's not a question, so actually it's a statement. He says, your talk is about class discrimination, but surely eliminating all discrimination is imperative. Can't have one, I'm assuming the end of that sentence is without the broader context.
Well, I think it's arbitrary and unjustifiable discrimination that we really want to prohibit, and that which damages people, because discrimination itself can be quite a neutral term. So I think you're right when you say it needs to be expanded and all unjustifiable discrimination. I'd absolutely agree, but speaking from my own personal experience, it's that of class, and I've just seen really how much more resources we as a country, human as well as others, and how much I think we'd improve if people didn't face our artificial barriers to hold them back.
Chris, do you want to come back on that? Yeah, you can unmute yourself if you wish. Work. Sorry, sorry that for some reason I'll try that again, but it was a lot of try it again. There's a lot of noise. No, sorry, for some reason there's a lot of static. Apologies, Chris. If you want to stick something in the chat, we'll take it that way. But sorry, there was static for me. Was there static for everybody else? Yeah. Okay. Right. Frank, let's hope we have a better luck with you. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, I'm Frank Ellis. My mother, Dr. Margaret Ellis, was a lecturer in medical biochemistry at Manchester University, and she started in the mid-1950s. And she was a local working class woman with an impeccable working class family. But she always considered herself working class. I think she had a bit of an inferiority complex towards people who might be considered more middle class at the university. But what was interesting was a lot of people would find it hard to accept that somebody who was working as a university lecturer could be considered working class. And yet, some academic salaries aren't as good as things like train drivers or firefighters, which you might consider to be working class. So I think we have to consider how we're defining class by occupation.
Well, firstly, I would have loved to have met your mother, actually. She sounds an extraordinary woman. I mean, to have come across as a woman, let alone working class as well, is quite extraordinary. You're absolutely right. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head, and people were very surprised when we had, this alliance of working class academics. Clearly, I no longer, as a professor, lie awake at night, 2 or 3 in the morning, sort of the hour of the wolf, wondering if I could pay my rent and have food. I'm very fortunate that I don't have anymore. But I still think there's a lot of experiences that I do have that I value, that I make, that I come from my working class experience and my working class life. And it was very interesting, actually. At our very first meeting of the Alliance, we'd set up this committee. A number of us had been truants, myself included. Now, I think if you had a meeting of academics at Manchester, or indeed most universities, there'd be very few truants, and yet, we had quite a few in our small group. And numbers had left university and come back in. A number had started, doctorates at later stages. I don't have a doctorate, which is actually quite unusual. I wrote a long book, but I don't have a doctorate. So I think there are ways of defining. As a barrister, I'm a member of something called the Middle Temple. All barristers have to join one of 4, they're called Inns of Court, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. And we've set up a diversity and equality committee, and we've included in that various socioeconomic factors. And I don't think, you're absolutely right, Frank, you can't rely on one. So we've got things like, and it's not exhaustive, I think it needs to be added, a parent's occupation when you were 14, have your parents ever been unemployed? The school, and I think the postcode of the school is important as well. So you can start, have you ever claimed benefit, have your parents claimed benefit as a child? And you can begin to build a picture. So I think definitions are more complex than simply, one facet. And you're absolutely right, as many academics are on strike, train drivers and others earn, significantly more. So it's not just a question of occupation. I think it's broader than that. But I don't know what you think, Frank, about that.
Yes, picking up one point, I work for British Rail in Derby, and it's often easy to see class discrimination within a small community. And I was asked once to look into jobs for one of my landlady's sons. So I was looking at jobs that weren't graduate level, but I was told they all needed qualifications, and I found that they didn't. But what was the case was that almost all the young people who'd been selected for these non-graduate jobs had gone to middle-class schools. And we hardly ever employed anybody in the site I was on in the British Rail, which is the research department, who had been to a working class school in Derby.
Right. No,
I thought it was a very interesting form of discrimination.
You're right. Certainly at universities, certain schools I'd heard say, well, ignore that school because the headmaster promotes that person, always saying they're wonderful. And the reason why the headmaster did that was simply because, he knew that he was up against people who, I went to a comprehensive in East London, and bog standard comprehensive was the description. But this particular headmaster of another area, he knew he had to really praise his students because they wouldn't get a look in. So you're absolutely right. There's a lot of discrimination that people wouldn't really think about, and that's why I think we need to make prohibit it, and then people start to look at it. You know, we can learn a lot from Black Lives Matter, for example, you know, unearthing, you know, some of these approaches really that people just don't think about.
Thanks, Frank. Julian, do you want to unmute yourself?
Okay. Right. I'm an old-fashioned class struggle sort of bloke. I remember having all sorts of arguments and debates with university colleagues in the late 80s, early 90s, when we were trying to put together a bundle of courses for training up what nowadays we'd call the non-profit sector. And all my colleagues wanted to ensure that these courses were a sort of, you know, that we were duly opposing in favour of equal opportunities. We wanted to oppose sexism, we wanted to oppose racism and things like that, until it came to the issue of classism. And I sort of said, hang about a second. I think class is a slightly different category, because class is not just about discrimination. Class points to sort of a series of oppressions which are more general. And so there's a history, as I'm sure you must be familiar with, of the left generally being slightly uncomfortable about treating class as a form of discrimination, because and if one accepted your argument nowadays, which in a sense is probably the best argument, then in a way the dear old class struggle has probably gone. Now maybe we've lost the class struggle, and I'm quite happy to debate that, but I do wonder whether there is some distinction between class as discrimination and class as a category of more broad, widespread oppression.
I see your point, but you know, sort of some scholars on race discrimination might make the same point about race discrimination, and certain feminist scholars may say the same, you know, about sex discrimination. I think one of the challenges is that your point where you say about the left, and you're absolutely right. And I think that's a sort of unique point, whereas the left may not be against racial or sexual equality. They see this as, or people may see it as almost like a way of avoiding fundamental changes in society. But for those who wish to see those fundamental changes, I don't see why it should be. But I also don't believe people should, you know, sacrifice their individual futures for an idea that they may not necessarily agree with, or if they agree with, it's possible to run the two together. So I'm familiar with that, as you rightly said, you know, that kind of opposition. But I think there is some change in, you know, some left-wing groups recognizing that, you know, this needs to be done. And in fact, the Labour Party, I was a commissioner on the Equality and Human Rights Commission, so let me disclose my any potential conflict. And one of the things we were asking for was the implementation of a provision which had been advocated by the Labour government, but never went into implementation, which was not to have a duty that public services are guaranteed to all on the basis, you know, of a sort of socio-economic or not to be prohibited on socio-economic discrimination. So you've got aspects of it. It's just people feel very nervous about the word class, really, and they shy away from it. And I don't think we should be nervous about it. I don't know what you think, Julian.
I think sort of others ought to be allowed in at the moment.
No, go on. If you want to say more, that's fine.
No, well, I'm always rather sort of proud of the fact that my A's are very flat. I think I'll just leave it there for the time being. If no one else comes back and you're still there, then maybe I will. But I'd end up rambling slightly. So I think sort of I don't want to do that. I'll mute myself and do some thinking and maybe raise my hand if I can clarify the answer. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, my colleague Lindsay has popped the link to the Alliance of Working Class Academics into the chat, and so that's something that people can explore further. I was wondering if there were any international initiatives that you thought that we could take on board here in some way? I was interested in what you said about Cyprus and its constitution, but is there anything else which, as a result of the alliance, you've thought, well, that could work in this country?
Well, that's what we're looking at in the alliance. It's fairly early days. We're hoping that the code will prompt some. I'm doing some work on class law. I'm writing a book on class law and status. So actually, next month I'm going to be looking in great depth at the Cypriot constitution and other initiatives. So I mean, there are countries like South Africa which doesn't expressly prohibit social class discrimination, but the courts have brought in through equality and dignity provisions and some socio-economic rights like health, education, life, socio-economic aspect of. They brought that into being other ways. So there are ways if there's a political will.
If there's a political will, thereby hangs a tale. Yes, Valerie, I think you want to say something to us.
Just to throw one or two other things in that are a bit different, but germane to the argument. I've got a great grandson who's 19 months old, who, with his father counting, he can count with things up to 10. Now, there is where our class distinction begins. It begins before then, of course, but hopefully, if that kind of parenting continues, the boy will go. If he's not having that kind of parenting, there's a big discrimination already set in. So that's one thing. It starts very early, and it starts in the home. I look at home and school. I was a teacher, and sometimes the things you did in school were counterbalanced by things that happened at home. The kid is at home how many hours a day compared with perhaps the 5 that is with you. That is something which compounds the problem of the division. And then the last point is language. We all speak a fairly moderate type of language with our vowels, as my colleague has just said. But if I were to sit here, now notice I say if I were, because I know that after if it's were and not was. Now, but so when you're watching and interviewing, you pick these things up. People say us books and them things when it should be those, etc. Now, somehow or other, we need to have more of this kind of input into the school. But then again, I come back to how the home will cope with if the kid goes home and says to the parent, it isn't them books, mother, it's those books. We have another issue. So there's a lot of, apart from all these things which you've talked about, which are so important, there are all these other issues which are, and notice I say issues, most people would say issues. It's double S, not SH. There's all those things which affect you when you're in an interview. If you're up against somebody who says it correctly, you may be clever and better for the job, but if your presence and your language is not up to it, you're going to lose out. So I don't know what we're going to do about that. And I'm working class, and do you know why I'm working class? Because I've always had to bloody well work for my living. That makes you working class in my eyes.
Well, I mean, you raised some very important points about the home, and I mean, anybody who's well, not anybody, but those of us, many of us who've grown up in working class families, have to deal with that kind of tension between home, perhaps home and school, home and society. Things, I was told, you're rising above your status, can't be done, and a whole host of phrases. And you're right, pronunciation is an issue, accent is an issue, it shouldn't be. And that's one of the reasons for prohibiting class discrimination, because actually interviewers can't overtly, if class discrimination were prohibited, they can't say, well, we're rejecting that person on the basis of class. You could start to question and so forth. And I don't think we should be, quick, not trying to eradicate rich accents. Actually, my husband is American, and he often tells me that words and phrases which are considered ungrammatical in this country are actually considered grammatical in the United States, and actually go back to 18th century English rather than so there's that aspect. I think the other aspect you raised about very young children and parenting, one way, of course, is to have preschool clubs and classes and which are welcoming to children of all classes, and obviously affordable, if not free. So I think there are ways through. And I noticed, as you said, issues, but you didn't say problems or insurmountable challenges. So I think that you've raised some very important points, and I think there are ways through them. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few questions in the chat, so let me move to Elaine's question. What about the way the government is trying to use class in the culture wars, e.g. white working class? I'm worried about it, how it is hijacked by the far right too.
Yes, I think that's true. Things are, that anybody who's seeking to use it in that way, I think it's up to the rest of us to speak out and show that actually, class is diverse. It isn't. I mean, that's why I quoted to you, from the Runnymede Trust. The Runnymede Trust actually was set up to deal with racial inequalities, and they that their approach, I think, is the correct one. Class covers, all the different protected characteristics, and it's not the exclusive terrain or property of one particular group. So I think, we've got to start speaking up. And part of the problem is a lot of people don't like to self-identify as working class because, they think it's going to damage them. And actually, if they're working, you've got a salary gap that based on class has been identified by the Social Mobility Commission. I'd actually call it evidence by gay academics who've said they found it harder to come out as working class in universities, and I think in other professions as well. So, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think, if we can do it, then I think it would be helpful in overcoming such distortions and exploitation.
Chris wonders, if legislation was to be introduced, could it be realistically enforced?
I don't think it's going to be instant. I mean, if it were introduced. But yes, I mean, if you look at the change in attitude that's occurred in relation to gay relationships and gay marriage, I mean, you've had this extraordinary change in public attitudes, which I think law has a symbolic value as well, contributed to in a major way. So I think it's a first step, but it's not the be all and end all.
I'm just going back. Right. Okay. Sorry, Paul. I thought it was a statement rather than a question. So, okay. Class discrimination is built into capitalism. The 1% of the capitalist class versus everyone else.
Well, I suspect Julian probably would endorse that. I think you can, if it's all right with you, because my voice is fading, I'm actually going to make this the last, I'm sorry, answer, although I'd be delighted to meet with you, hopefully in person at a later stage if I'm invited, and we can continue the discussion. But I think you could have, my own personal view is you could have capitalism with a human face. And so that it doesn't have to be as individualistic, and it can be along, more than welfareism. So I think we can challenge that. Even if you believe it, you can still abolish, at least in law, class discrimination and see where that takes you. I think it's worth a try. There are too many lives we've seen in terms of differences in life expectancy. And I think it's a very urgent problem.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Geraldine. And certainly, yes, conversations could continue. And I'm sorry you haven't been able to visit us in person, but we do hope that you can do that. Once you've written your book, come back and talk to us in person. And yeah, other people who have taken part, thank you very much indeed. But obviously, specifically, thank you to Geraldine for getting off her sickbed and coming to talk to us. We are most grateful. Next week's talk, so that's Wednesday, the 8th of December at 2 o'clock, will be live in our annex, we hope, as well as online. If you'd like to come and join us, we would love to see you in person. Keep an eye on our website about that. So we'll be enjoying a screening of a new film, How Does It Feel, by artist Amy Pennington. And then Amy will be in conversation with sociologist Lisa McKenzie. This talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly, we hope, and we'll be putting the link on the event webpage. A reminder again that our talks are as usual free. However, we would like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. Thanks so much for those of you who do that on a regular basis. Even one-off donations, we're most grateful for those as well. There's a donate button on our website. Thanks again and goodbye. Take care. In solidarity, very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Bye-bye.